What if the letters from your dead grandmother revealed you're not who you think you are? You never told me about Grandma's letters. Maya's voice cracked the silence in the dim living room, her words landing like stones in still water. The old oak table between them bore the weight of faded photographs and a yellowed envelope, its seal broken just minutes ago. Sarah froze, her hands midway to the teapot, steam curling lazily from its spout like unspoken regrets. The scent of chamomile mingled with the musty paper, thick in the air, pulling everyone deeper into the moment. Mark shifted in his armchair, the leather creaking under his broad frame. His eyes, shadowed by years of unvoiced resentments, flicked to the envelope. "Maya, it's not that simple," he said, his tone edged with the defensiveness that always surfaced when the past clawed its way back. He wanted their approval, their nod that he'd done enough. But here it was again, his anger simmering, a barrier he couldn't quite dismantle. Jenna sat beside Maya on the worn sofa, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, nails bitten short from nights spent worrying over family threads fraying at the edges. She reached out, touching her sister's arm lightly, the gesture born of her drive to weave them back together, even as her own chest tightened with the fear of everything unraveling. "We didn't know how to bring it up," Jenna murmured, her voice soft, pleading for harmony. But inside, unease gnawed at her. What if this secret split them wider? Maya's gaze dropped to the letters, ink-blurred words from a grandmother she'd barely known, confessing a hidden affair that had splintered the family long before her birth. The revelation hit like a forgotten bruise reopening, flooding her with flashes of childhood nights alone, wondering why the house always felt half-empty. Her throat burned, not with tears yet, but with the raw ache of betrayal layered over old wounds. "This explains everything," she whispered, tracing a line of script. "The fights, the silences. Why I always felt like I was chasing shadows." Sarah finally poured the tea, the liquid glugging unevenly into cups, mirroring the tremor in her hands. She was anxious, yes, hovering on the brink of confrontation she'd avoided for so long, terrified they'd see her as the weak link. But beneath it, a fragile hope stirred. Maybe this fracture could mend them. "I thought protecting you meant keeping it buried," she admitted, sliding a cup toward Maya. The porcelain warmed her palms, a small anchor. But hiding it poisoned us all. Mark leaned forward, elbows on knees, his face a map of unresolved fury from his own boyhood echoes in those letters. "You think I wanted this?" His voice rose, then faltered, vulnerability cracking through. He glanced at Sarah, then Jenna, seeking the validation that had eluded him since he was Maya's age. The room pulsed with their shared discomfort, the air humming with the weight of decades unspoken. Jenna's eyes darted between them, her people-pleasing instinct urging her to smooth it over. But the unease coiled tighter, her own needs, buried under the family's, surfacing unbidden. "We can talk about it now," she said, forcing steadiness into her words. "Really talk." Maya nodded slowly, the letters crinkling under her fingers. In that contemplative pause, amid the clink of cups and the faint tick of the wall clock, a tentative light pierced the gloom. Not resolution, but the first uneasy step toward it. The family sat, bound by the secret's unraveling, their scars visible at last, whispering possibilities of healing. As the steam from the teapot dissipated into the shadowed room, Maya's resolve softened under the ache of unearthed truths. Vulnerability bloomed like fragile dawn light, coaxing her toward the ghosts of her past. Hours blurred into introspection, the letter's echoes urging her to bridge the chasm with her brother. With hopeful hesitation, she traced his faded number on her screen, the weight of shared wounds lightening just enough to invite possibility. "David, it's been too long since we talked like this, without the walls up." Maya's voice filtered through the phone's speaker, soft but insistent, pulling David from the worn armchair in the dimly lit den. The receiver cradled against his ear felt heavier than usual, its cord twisting like an old vine across the oak side table, cluttered with half-read books and a cooling mug of chamomile tea. Mark paced near the window, his shadow stretching long across the faded Persian rug, while Jenna sat cross-legged on the sofa, her fingers absently tracing the frayed edge of a throw pillow, eyes fixed on David with a mix of curiosity and quiet dread. David cleared his throat, the sound rough in the sudden quiet of the room. Maya, yeah, I got your message earlier. The letters, Grandma's stuff. What made you dig them out now? His words came guarded, each one measured to keep the old fissures from widening. Though his free hand clenched the armrest, knuckles paling against the dark leather. Across from him, Jenna leaned forward, her breath catching just enough to notice. She'd always been the one stitching the family quilt, mending tears before they unraveled completely. But tonight, her drive for harmony twisted into anxiety, a knot in her chest, warning of the conflict she feared most. "Tell her we're here if she wants," Jenna murmured to David, her voice a gentle prod, though her own needs, buried deep under layers of pleasing others, flickered unspoken, a shadow she pushed aside. Mark stopped pacing, his boots scuffing the rug's intricate patterns of crimson and gold. Anger simmered beneath his defensive stance, the validation he craved from his parents forever just out of reach, stirring childhood wounds he'd armored against for years. "Yeah, put it on speaker," he said, sharper than intended, his fear of vulnerability making him lash out. "No secrets this time. We're all in this mess together." David hesitated, his isolated world cracking under the pressure, the facade of strength he'd built to ward off abandonment feeling thinner by the second. With a nod, he pressed the button, Maya's intake of breath echoing into the room like a shared exhale. The air carried the faint scent of aged paper from the letters David had glimpsed in his mind's eye. Ink faded, but emotions sharp, and the subtle warmth of the tea mingling with the earthy undertone of the den's wooden beams. "I've been reading them," Maya continued, her tone weaving vulnerability into the line, raw and unfiltered. "Grandma wrote about us as kids, David. The fights, the way Dad shut down after Mom left. It hurts, seeing how we carried that silence like an inheritance. I thought, maybe we could talk about it. Really talk, not just gloss over." Jenna's eyes softened, hope threading through her overwhelm as she imagined the family piecing itself back, threads of unity pulling taut. David swallowed, his guarded heart exposed in the pause, the fear of weakness battling his drive to protect himself. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he admitted, voice low, the words tasting of old rust. But in the quiet that followed, Mark stepped closer, his anger yielding to a tentative curiosity, the strained bonds between them humming with possibility. The conversation unfolded slowly, words tumbling like pebbles into a deepening pool. Recollections of slammed doors, unspoken apologies, the weight of unresolved scars, lifting just enough to let light filter through. Jenna interjected softly, offering bridges. Mark's defenses chipped away, with reluctant questions. David, for the first time in years, let the isolation ebb. In that introspective space, vulnerability bloomed, not as fracture alone, but as the first hopeful mend. As the words hung in the dim light of the den, a fragile warmth settled over David, the chord's twist echoing the tentative uncoiling of old tensions. Yet beneath Maya's gentle probing, a subtle undercurrent stirred, his shoulders tensing imperceptibly, the receiver warming against his palm like a reluctant confession. In that suspended moment, the hope of reconnection flickered, introspective and alive, even as shadows of buried hurts began to surface, promising revelations laced with sorrow. "Why have you shut me out like this, David? After everything we've been through?" Sarah's voice crackled through the phone line, laced with a quiet urgency that sliced through the den's stillness. David gripped the receiver tighter, his thumb tracing the worn grooves in the plastic, as if they held some anchor. The half-read books on the side table, tattered spines of forgotten histories, seemed to lean in, witnesses to the fracture widening between them. He could picture her on the other end, pacing the kitchen in their childhood home, the linoleum cool under her bare feet, the scent of chamomile tea lingering from her evening ritual. "I haven't shut you out," David replied, his tone clipped. a barrier rising swift as a drawn blind. He shifted in the armchair, the leather creaking under his weight, releasing a faint, musty aroma that mingled with the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. But the words felt hollow even to him, echoes of the isolation he'd built, brick by unyielding brick. Across the room, Jenna paused in her folding of laundry, the soft cotton shirts piling like unspoken apologies on the ottoman. She'd been listening since the call began, her drive to mend the family's frayed edges pulling her closer, despite the anxiety knotting her stomach. Sarah's plea hung in the air, stirring the old wounds Jenna had long tried to soothe with gestures. Holiday cards, shared recipes, anything to avoid the storm. Now, with David's defensiveness thickening the space between them, she felt the weight of her own neglected needs pressing in. Sarah pressed on, her breath uneven over the line. Then why does it feel like betrayal every time I reach out? You left after Dad died, vanished into your job, your life up there. Mom needed you. I needed you. And now, it's like we're strangers. The accusation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of abandonment flooding David's chest. He stood abruptly, the phone cord yanking taut, books teetering on the table's edge. Vulnerability clawed at him, the fear of being exposed as the weak link in their chain, the one who'd fled the grief, leaving Sarah to shoulder it alone. You think I didn't feel it too? The way everything fell apart? I was protecting us, protecting myself, from falling apart completely. What do you want from me, Sarah? Absolution? Jenna stepped forward, her hand hovering near his shoulder, a tentative bridge in the charged silence. Her heart ached with the hope of unity, yet the scene unfolded like a mirror to their scars. David's guarded stance, shoulders hunched against the onslaught. Sarah's hesitant voice, raw with the pain of rejection she'd buried for years. David, Jenna murmured, her voice a soft counterpoint. Maybe it's time we all stop running from it. On the line, Sarah's exhale trembled. I just want my brother back. Not the walls. Us. David sank back into the chair, the fight draining from him, leaving a hollow sadness that seeped into his bones. The den's warm glow from the lamp felt mocking now, illuminating the unresolved threads binding them. Love tangled with loss. For the first time, the isolation he'd clung to cracked, revealing the hopeful glimmer beneath. A family not yet lost, if they could face the fractures together. But tonight, the unearthed feelings lingered, heavy as the cord coiled at his feet, a poignant reminder of paths diverged and hearts still yearning to reconnect. As the receiver clicked into place, the weight of Sarah's words lingered in the air like a half-forgotten melody, stirring echoes of childhood summers when secrets first took root. In the adjoining room, Maya paused amid scattered photo albums, their faded images evoking a tender ache of what once was. Nostalgia bloomed softly within her, a hopeful light piercing the introspective haze, urging her toward the confrontation that promised, at last, to mend the frayed bonds of their shared history. Sarah pushed the den door open, the hinges creaking like old bones under her palm. The scent of aged leather and stale coffee hit her first, pulling her into the dim room where David sat hunched over the desk, his back a rigid wall against the world. Mark lounged in the armchair across from him, arms crossed, his foot tapping an erratic rhythm on the frayed rug. The phone receiver lay discarded on the desk, its coiled cord twisted like a noose. I can't do this over wires anymore, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the knot twisting in her chest. She stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click that echoed her resolve. David's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn. Mark's tapping stopped, his eyes flicked to her, sharp and wary. David finally swiveled in his chair, his face etched with lines that spoke of years holding everything in. Sarah, this isn't the time. We've said enough. No, we haven't. She crossed to the center of the room, her shoes sinking into the carpet that still bore faint stains from their childhood spills, berry juice from lazy summer afternoons when laughter filled this house instead of silence. The memory tugged at her, warm and bittersweet, a flicker of what they once had. Not about Mom. not about how she left us all scrambling, pretending everything was fine while we hid our hurts like dirty secrets. Mark leaned forward, elbows on knees, his jaw set in that familiar defensive angle. "What are you digging up now? That's ancient history. Let it stay buried." Sarah met his gaze, her hands unclenching at her sides. The air in the room thickened with the weight of unspoken years, the faint tick of the wall clock marking time like a heartbeat. She could almost taste the nostalgia, the sharp tang of apple pie from Mom's rare good days, the way the kitchen light would catch her hair as she hummed off-key tunes. But those moments had frayed, unraveling into the quiet abandonments that shaped them. David's long hours at work to avoid the emptiness, her own habit of smoothing edges until they bled, Mark's fists clenched against the void. "I remember the night she packed her bags," Sarah continued, her words spilling out like long-held breath. "I was 10, hiding under the stairs, listening to the suitcase wheels rumble over the floorboards. You were both upstairs, David, pretending to sleep, Mark, punching your pillow until it tore. We never talked about how that broke us. How it made you build these walls, Dad, so high no one could climb them. How it made me swallow every fight, afraid you'd all vanish too." David's eyes softened, just a fraction, the guard cracking under her words. He rubbed his knuckles, the calluses from years of carpentry rough against his skin. "I was trying to keep us together. Strength, that's what we needed." Mark snorted, but his voice wavered. "Strength? You mean shutting down? Like when I wrecked the bike, and you just walked away? Like my screw-ups didn't matter? I was screaming inside, man. Just like after she left." The confessions hung between them, raw threads weaving through the room's shadows. Sarah felt the pressure build, a hopeful ache blooming in her chest, the possibility of mending what time had torn. David's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the desk lamp, flicking it on. Warm light spilled across their faces, illuminating the shared lines of pain and the faint spark of recognition. For the first time, the isolation felt bridgeable, the hidden dissatisfaction surfacing not as weapons, but as paths to something whole. "I don't want to avoid this anymore," Sarah whispered, stepping closer. "We can remember the good parts too, the picnics, the stories she told. Maybe that's where we start healing." David nodded, slow and tentative, while Mark uncrossed his arms, the anger ebbing into quiet vulnerability. In that moment, the din transformed, no longer a fortress of silence, but a space where old wounds might finally breathe. Hours later, as the din's tense murmurs faded into the evening hush, Maya's thoughts turned inward, a quiet recognition blooming amid the day's unraveling threads. Across the quiet suburb, she lingered in the hallway's soft lamplight, her heart a contemplative rhythm against the walls of home. Hope flickered like a distant star, urging her forward through the introspective veil, toward the fragile bridge of truth waiting just beyond the kitchen door. Denial sliced through the room like a sudden draft, Jenna's voice cracking on the edge of her words as she leaned back from the desk, her chair scraping against the worn oak floor. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway she'd just pushed open, the scent of aged leather from David's armchair mingling with the sharp tang of fresh tears she hadn't yet shed. Mark's foot stopped its tapping mid-beat, his crossed arms unfolding as he straightened in a seat, eyes flicking between his sister and their mother. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jenna said, her hands fluttering to smooth the edge of a faded photo album on the desk, as if the gesture could erase the years. Her voice held that familiar lilt, the one that always promised calm, but now it trembled, laced with a defensiveness that made the air between them thicken. "We gave you everything. A home, stability. Why drag this up now?" Sarah's chest tightened. The words she'd rehearsed in the hallway, snippets of lonely nights in her childhood bedroom, the unspoken weight of her parents' endless arguments echoing through thin walls, lodging in her throat like dry bread. She wanted healing, a bridge across the chasm. But Jenna's denial hit like a wall, unyielding. "Mom, it wasn't everything. I remember the silences more than the stability. The way you'd lock yourself in here, and Dad would just leave. I was scared all the time, pretending it was fine because you needed me to. Mark shifted, his chair creaking under the sudden movement. Anger flickered in his jaw, not at Sarah this time, but at the echo of his own buried stories. She's right, Mom. You think we didn't see it? The fights, the way you'd push us aside like we were interruptions? His voice rose, defensive edges sharpening, but beneath it lurked a plea, for validation, for someone to finally see the boy who'd punched walls to drown out the chaos, only to hide the bruises. Jenna's eyes darted to the window, where late afternoon light filtered through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk, piled with old letters and half-forgotten trinkets. Overwhelmed, she pressed a hand to her forehead, her drive for harmony fracturing under the pressure. This isn't fair. I was trying to hold us together, pleasing everyone but myself. If I'd shown how hurt I was, what then? The family would have shattered. Her words dissolved into a whisper, anxiety coiling tight, her fear of conflict blooming like an old wound reopened. The rupture hung there, raw and echoing. Sarah feeling the isolation settle heavier than before, a vast, empty space where understanding should have been. She stepped forward, the floorboards groaning softly under her weight, drawn by the faint hope that this breaking might lead somewhere. Mark reached out, his hand hovering near her arm, not quite touching, his anger softening into something vulnerable, a shared recognition dawning in the quiet. In that suspended moment, amid the leather's musty embrace and the faint bitterness of cooling coffee, Sarah glimpsed it, the pain they all carried, not as separate burdens, but threads weaving them closer. Jenna's gaze lifted, meeting hers, and for a breath, the denial cracked, revealing a flicker of the same hidden dissatisfaction. Not resolution, not yet, but a tentative light, hope that speaking the shadows might one day mend what silence had torn. As the echoes of denial faded into the heavy silence of the house, Maya slipped away to the quiet of her room upstairs, the weight of unspoken fractures pressing against her chest. Hours blurred into a restless dusk, her thoughts weaving through the family's tangled threads. Jenna's resolve, Sarah's stunned stillness, the shadows of old hurts resurfacing. In that introspective hush, a flicker of hope stirred amid the despair, urging her to see not just the deepened wounds, but the fragile possibility of mending them with gentler hands. Mark's voice shattered the taut silence, raw and unyielding as he shoved back from the table, his chair legs screeching against the floorboards like a protest long overdue. The room, cluttered with faded family photos and the faint, earthy scent of cooling chamomile tea, seemed to contract around them. Jenna, frozen mid-breath, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. David, staring into his untouched mug, as if it held secrets deeper than his own. "I can't do this anymore," Mark spat, his words tumbling out like stones dislodged from a crumbling wall. His eyes, red-rimmed and fierce, darted between his sister and father. "You act like everything's fine, like we can just pretend the past didn't carve us up. Remember those summers at the lake? Dad, you promising we'd fish all day, but vanishing by noon for work calls that never ended. I waited, every time, rod in hand, feeling like I was the one who wasn't enough." Jenna's pulse quickened, a flutter in her chest that made the air taste metallic. She wanted to bridge the gap, to weave their frayed edges back together with words soft as thread. But the weight of it all pressed down, her drive for harmony buckling under the strain. "Mark, please," she murmured, reaching across the scarred wooden surface, her fingers brushing the cool porcelain of a saucer. Anxious heat bloomed in her cheeks. One wrong syllable, and the family she'd fought to hold might splinter irreparably. Yet beneath her plea, her own buried ache stirred. A childhood of smoothing edges, of swallowing her questions about mother's long absences to keep the peace, only to wake hollow in the quiet nights. David shifted in his armchair, the leather creaking under him like an old confession. He gripped the mug tighter, knuckles paling, his guarded shell cracking just enough to let vulnerability seep through. Strength had always been his armor, forged in the isolation of a boy left to navigate empty evenings alone after the divorce. Doors closing not just on rooms, but on any chance of reaching out. "You think you're the only one who waited?" he said finally, voice low and gravelly, the words pulling from a place he'd long sealed off. Fear coiled in his gut, being seen as the weak link, abandoned once more in their judgment. But the pressure built, inexorable, forcing the shadow of his isolation into the light. "I built walls because showing hurt meant losing what little I had left. Every birthday, staring at that empty chair across from me, wondering if anyone noticed I was still here." The confessions hung between them, not as weapons but as fragile offerings, the room's dim lamplight casting warm glows on their faces, illuminating the shared lines of old pain. Jenna felt it then, a deep, wrenching despair washing over her as she realized her careful nudges toward healing had only pried open these wounds wider. Salt in the raw. Tears welled, hot and unbidden, tracing paths down her skin. She'd poured herself into unity, neglecting the echo of her own neglected needs, only to see the family teeter on this precipice. But in the quiet that followed, a tentative thread emerged. Mark's shoulders easing slightly, David's gaze lifting to meet hers, the air humming with unspoken possibility. Perhaps, in this unraveling, they could mend not just the surface, but the hidden fractures, step by aching step toward something whole. As the fragments of that fractured evening settled like dust in the dim lamplight, Maya retreated into the quiet sanctuary of her thoughts, the sting of buried wounds lingering, yet yielding to a tentative spark of resolve. Nights blurred into mornings heavy with introspection, until hope, soft and insistent, urged her forward, toward a door that promised unraveling the knots of family shadows. "I have to bridge this chasm before it swallows us whole." Jenna's voice emerged soft at first, threading through the hush like a fragile vine seeking sunlight. She leaned forward, her palms flattening against the worn oak table, the faint stickiness of spilled tea lingering under her fingers. The steam from the chamomile had long dissipated, leaving behind a subtle herbal whisper that mingled with the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. "Mark's right," she said, her words gaining quiet resolve. "We've all been holding back, pretending everything's fine. But it's not. And if we don't face it now, we never will." David's gaze lifted from the mug, his knuckles whitening around its handle. The ceramic felt cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. He'd built walls for years, thick, unyielding ones, to keep the world at bay, to hide the boy who'd watched his father walk out without a backward glance. Vulnerability? It was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when every crack invited abandonment. Yet here, in this room thick with unspoken histories, his drive to shield himself warred with something deeper, a pull toward the people across from him. "What do you want me to say, Jenna?" His tone roughened, edged with the isolation he'd nursed like a secret wound. "That I'm scared? That every time things get close, I brace for the door to slam shut again?" Sarah sat beside him, her breath catching at his admission. The air carried the faint, comforting scent of the family's old wool blankets draped over the chairs, evoking memories of quieter days when hugs mended what words couldn't. She'd always sidestepped the hard truths, her anxiety a constant hum urging retreat, fearing her pleas for understanding would only echo back as rejection. But healing, that drive pulsed stronger now, insistent as her heartbeat. Her fingers, unadorned and steady, reached across to touch David's arm, the fabric of his sleeve soft and familiar under her touch. "David, you're not alone in that fear. I've been avoiding it too, bottling everything up until it festers. Remember last year when I withdrew after Mom's letters? I thought if I just stayed quiet, we'd all stay together. But it only pushed us further apart." The words hung between them, not heavy, but luminous, like the first hints of dawn piercing a long night. Jenna's eyes, wide with the anxiety of potential fracture, softened as she watched her siblings. Her own shadow loomed, the endless pleasing, the way she'd smoothed edges until her needs blurred into invisibility. "I've been the same," she confessed, her voice trembling yet clear, carrying the rich timbre of chamomile's warmth. Chasing harmony at any cost, even if it meant ignoring how exhausted I am. But seeing you both open up, it makes me believe we can rebuild this, together. Sarah nodded, a tentative smile curving her lips, the taste of possibility sweet on her tongue. That's why I didn't give up. Yesterday, I found a therapist, someone who works with families like ours, unraveling the trauma we've carried since Dad left. She's helped me see that confronting this isn't about tearing us down, it's about weaving us stronger. What if we went together? Not as a fix, but as a start. David exhaled, the guarded armor cracking just enough to let hope seep in. The room expanded around them, the faded photos on the walls seeming to brighten, capturing not just past joys, but the promise of mended bonds. For the first time in years, isolation felt distant, replaced by the tentative warmth of shared breath, of vulnerabilities laid bare like offerings. Unity flickered alive, fragile yet real, pulling them toward a horizon where healing waited, patient and profound. Those words lingered like echoes in a vast cavern, the chasm Jenna had named now a mirror to Maya's own shadowed divides. Days melted into contemplative evenings, her fingers tracing the table's scars as resolve stirred beneath the surface. A quiet courage unfurling like dawn through fog. In the hush of the therapist waiting room, that fragile vine of hope began to take root, promising a path beyond the fracture. That's when Sarah realized the silence in the room wasn't emptiness, it was an invitation. A fragile space where her guarded words could finally breathe. The therapist's office wrapped around them like a well-worn blanket, its faded blue walls absorbing the late afternoon light filtering through half-drawn blinds. The scent of chamomile tea, now cold in mismatched mugs, mingled with the faint, earthy trace of old books stacked on a corner shelf. Sarah sat at the edge of her chair, her fingers tracing the frayed seam of her sweater, each loop a small anchor against the pull of unspoken years. Across from her, David shifted, his broad shoulders hunched, as if shielding a flame from wind. While Mark slouched beside him, arms crossed tight over his chest, eyes fixed on a scuff mark on the rug. "I've carried this weight so long," Sarah said, her voice a tentative thread, not breaking the quiet, but weaving into it. "Pretending we're all just fine. But I'm tired, David. Tired of smiling through the cracks." David's gaze lifted, slow and deliberate, meeting hers for the first time that session, without the usual deflection. His hands, calloused from years at the mill, unclenched on his knees. "You think I don't know that? Every damn day I wake up telling myself to hold it together. For you, for him." He nodded toward Mark, the word him landing like a stone in still water. "But inside, it's like I'm hollow. Always has been, since Dad left. I built these walls so high, I forgot how to climb down." Mark's breath hitched, a sharp intake that cut through the air. He uncrossed his arms, leaning forward, his knuckles whitening against the armrest. "You both act like I don't see it, like your strength fixes everything." His voice cracked, raw edges fraying the anger he'd worn like armor. "I was a kid, yelling because no one listened, and now? I'm still yelling inside, waiting for you to say it's okay to hurt, to admit you hurt too." The therapist, a woman with kind eyes and a notebook balanced on her lap, nodded gently. But the room held its own momentum now, propelled by the unraveling. Sarah felt it then, a warmth blooming in her chest. Not the familiar knot of anxiety, but something fiercer, like sunlight piercing fog. She remembered the nights after Mark's outbursts, when she'd lie awake, replaying the family's fractures, convincing herself healing meant enduring in silence. But here, in this circle of shared breath, she saw the pattern for what it was. Not a chain, but a thread she could choose to mend or sever. "I thought if I pushed it down," Sarah continued, her words gaining steadiness, "we'd all just move on, avoid the mess. But look at us, still circling the same wound. She reached out, her hand hovering near David's, then settling there, palm to palm, the contact electric with long-denied possibility. I've survived worse than this isolation. The miscarriages, the moves, watching you both pull away. And I'm still here. We all are. That means something. It means we can rebuild, not just patch. David's fingers curled around hers, tentative at first, then firm, his eyes glistening with the vulnerability he'd armored against for decades. You're right. God, you're right. I don't want to be that man anymore, the one who runs from the fear. Mark wiped at his face, a quick swipe that betrayed the tears he couldn't quite hide. Then don't. Teach me how to stop running too. I need to know it's safe. In that moment, as their voices layered, hesitant confessions giving way to quieter affirmations, Sarah felt courage unfurl within her. Not as a shout, but a steady flame. The cycle of guarded silences, the inheritance of abandonment and anger, it didn't have to define them. For the first time, she glimpsed a future where vulnerability was the bridge, not the chasm. And hope, tentative yet real, began to light the path ahead. 3 days later, the fragile invitation of that afternoon's silence had ripened into a quiet introspection, wrapping Maya in its contemplative folds as she sat alone in her sun-dappled apartment. The therapist's words echoed faintly, stirring unease amid budding hope, her fingers tracing the edge of a blank journal. Shadows of shared pain lingered like autumn leaves, compelling her toward an uncharted vulnerability, the air thick with the promise of words yet unspoken. The faint creak of the leather chair beneath Mark pulled Sarah back, his small hand in hers, sticky from melting popsicles, promising they'd always fix things together. She blinked, the memory dissolving into the dimming light of the therapist's office. The silence stretched, not empty now, but laced with the unsaid. Sarah's fingers tightened around the folded paper in her lap, the one she'd carried for 3 days like a secret bruise. Across from her, Mark leaned forward, elbows on knees, his face a map of lines etched by years of buried storms. Jenna sat beside him, her posture straight, but her eyes darting, as if weighing every word against the family's fragile thread. "I can't keep pretending," Sarah said finally, her voice a quiet unraveling. The words hung, pulling at the air like threads from an old sweater. She unfolded the letter, its edges softened from rereading, and slid it across the low table. "I wrote this after our last fight. Meant to burn it, but here." Mark's gaze dropped to the paper, his breath catching. He didn't touch it at first, just stared, the vulnerability cracking through his guarded stance. "Sarah," he murmured, the name rough, like gravel underfoot. His drive to connect warred with the fear gnawing at him, those childhood echoes of a father's rage, now mirrored in his own unchecked anger. What if opening this opens everything? Jenna reached out, her hand hovering before resting lightly on the table, a bridge between them. She'd always smoothed the edges, the people-pleaser yielding her own needs to keep peace, but now her assertiveness flickered, demanding space. "Then we let it," she said, voice steady yet edged with unease. The word tear lingered unspoken, her fear of fracture coiling in her chest like smoke. "I've been holding back too, playing the glue. But I need you both to hear me, my voice, not just echo yours." Sarah nodded, frustration ebbing into determination, her avoidance of conflict shattering like thin ice. The letter trembled slightly in the space between them, its ink a confession. Admissions of resentment nursed in silence, pleas for understanding their shared scars, the losses that had armored them against each other. Mark finally took it, unfolding with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the loops of her handwriting. A raw ache surfaced in his expression, the mask of stoic control slipping. "I pushed you away because facing this means facing me, the anger I can't always leash." The room filled with their breaths, uneven and real, the faded blue walls holding the weight without judgment. Jenna leaned in, her own words spilling now, advocating for the unity she craved, but on terms that included her unspoken hurts. The nights she'd sacrificed sleep to mend their rifts, neglecting the hollow ache within. Unease threaded through it all, a subtle tremor in their voices, the fear that vulnerability might unravel them further. Yet in the exposure, hope glinted. Sarah's resolve met Mark's tentative openness, Jenna's advocacy weaving them closer. Mark set the letter down, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Let's talk it out, face to face like you asked." His voice softened, the invitation a step toward the boy in the memory, the brother ready to mend. As the words flowed, halting then steady, the unease lingered but softened, a necessary shadow to the light breaking through their guarded hearts. As the therapist's door clicked shut behind her, Sarah wandered into the twilight, the child's promise lingering like a fragile thread. Days unfolded in quiet rumination, her thoughts circling the family's fractured history with tentative hope. She dispatched the letter, words heavy with unspoken yearnings. Now, in the soft glow of his study, Mark turned the envelope over in his hands, a flicker of suspicion shadowing the budding possibility of mending what time had torn. The faint scent of aged paper lingered from the letter clutched in David's hand, its edges frayed like the memories it unearthed. Jenna watched him across the scarred wooden table in the dimly lit cafe they'd chosen, neutral ground, away from the therapist's sterile walls. Mark sat beside her, his knee bouncing faintly under the tablecloth, a rhythm that betrayed the storm he usually kept leashed. David finally unfolded the note, his eyes scanning the words she'd poured out weeks ago. Pleas for truth, for unraveling the knots their mother had tied around their childhoods. He'd hesitated then, his reply a curt email after days of silence. Now, here he was, face drawn, the lines around his mouth deepening as he set the paper down. "I didn't know what to make of it at first," David said, his voice low, threading through the murmur of distant conversations and the clink of porcelain. He met Jenna's gaze, then flicked to Mark's, suspicion flickering like a shadow in his eyes. Did they expect him to crack open just like that? To bare the wounds he'd buried under years of distance? "You think a letter fixes everything? After all this time?" Jenna leaned forward, her fingers tracing the warm rim of her teacup, steam curling up to soften the edges of her resolve. She'd written it not to demand, but to pull them back together, to advocate for the space where her own voice, long silenced by the role of fixer, could finally breathe. "It's not about fixing, David. It's about seeing. Mom's choices, they left scars on all of us. I want to understand why she shut down like that after Dad left. Why she made us feel like we were the ones breaking." Mark shifted, his broad shoulders hunching slightly, vulnerability etching his features in the soft afternoon light, filtering through the cafe's lace curtains. He'd come to confront this, to seek the connection he'd lost in the haze of his anger. But David's wariness pricked at him, stirring the old fury he fought to contain. "I get the hesitation," he admitted, his words measured. Each one a step toward the raw core he feared exposing. "Hell, I felt it too when Jenna showed me the draft. But hiding it? That's what she did. Locked us out while her own pain ate her alive. I remember the night she'd locked the door, crying about abandonment like it was our fault. Made me so mad I punched walls just to feel something else." David's jaw worked silently, his fingers drumming once on the table, a telltale crack in his armored facade. He wanted to bolt, to preserve the illusion of strength that had kept abandonment's ghost at bay. But the letter had hooked him, stirring a reluctant desire to probe their mother's actions, to see if understanding could mend what isolation had torn. Suspicion lingered in his narrowed eyes, probing their motives. Were they using this to drag him into their mess? Yet, beneath it, a tentative empathy stirred, hopeful threads weaving through the doubt. "She always said we were too much like him, too needy. I thought it was just her way of pushing us away so she wouldn't have to face it. But reading your words, Jenna, it hit different. Like maybe she was scared of losing us for good." The air between them thickened, not with tension, but with the weight of shared glimpses, flashes of a mother unraveling, her traumas casting long shadows over their young lives. Jenna reached out, her hand hovering near David's, not touching, but offering. "We're not losing anyone now, not if we talk through it." Mark nodded, his bounce stilling, a quiet acceptance blooming in his chest. David exhaled, the suspicion easing into something softer, a bridge forming in the contemplative pause. For the first time, the family's fractured pieces glinted with possibility. Empathy's light piercing the introspective haze. As the cafe's murmur faded into the evening hush, Jenna folded the letter away, her fingers trembling with unspoken fears that echoed David's silence. Days blurred in quiet reflection, each moment laced with tentative hope amid the shadows of old wounds. Yet beneath the calm, a knot of apprehension tightened, drawing her inexorably toward the neutral park bench where Maya waited, the air thick with the weight of buried resentments waiting to unravel. The echo of unspoken words where laughter once filled their childhood home. Jenna's gaze lingered on the letter in David's fist, its creases deepening like furrows in forgotten soil. The cafe's low hum, clinking porcelain, distant murmurs, pressed against the void at their table, a scarred oak island amid the neutral bustle they'd sought. Sarah shifted beside her, the faint creak of the wooden chair the only sound breaking the hush. Her fingers tracing idle patterns on the edge of her untouched coffee cup, steam long dissipated. David cleared his throat, the paper rustling as he set it down. It changes things." His voice cracked, not from volume, but from the weight it carried, eyes flicking between them like a man testing thin ice. He wanted to bridge the gap, to let the cracks show without shattering. Yet the old fear coiled tight, abandonment's shadow whispering that vulnerability invited exile. Jenna leaned forward, her posture straight but not rigid, a quiet assertion blooming where deference once ruled. "It does. But we've danced around this long enough." She met his eyes, her words a gentle push toward unity, even as the specter of fracture loomed in her chest. The people-pleaser in her urged retreat, but she held ground, voice steady. "We need to say it all." Sarah's breath hitched, a sharp intake that sliced the air. Frustration etched lines around her mouth, determination fueling the fire she'd banked for years. The avoidance that had let resentments fester now crumbled under the pressure. Her fear of rejection, a cold knot in her gut. Old grievances bubbled up, the late nights alone, the absences masked as necessity. The way their parents' shadows had left her grasping at ghosts. "I can't anymore," Sarah burst out, her voice rising like a wave cresting after too long underwater. Tears welled, not spilling yet, but glistening on the brink. "You both left me there, in that house, picking up pieces no one else saw. Dad's rages, Mom's silences. They carved me hollow, and I was just a kid, begging for someone to notice." The words tumbled, raw and unfiltered, painting the neglect in stark strokes. Empty dinner plates echoing her solitude, the creak of floorboards under her pacing feet at night. The abandonment that echoed louder than any shout. Fear laced her confession, the terror of misunderstanding twisting her features. Yet she pressed on, desperate for resolution. David's face paled, the facade splintering further. He reached across the table, hand hovering before settling on hers. A tentative bridge over his own chasm of isolation. "I didn't see it. God, Sarah, I was running from my own ghosts, thinking if I held it together, we'd all be safe." His admission hung there, vulnerability seeping through, the fear of weakness yielding to a deeper ache for connection. Jenna's heart pounded, the family's unraveling threads pulling taut in her mind. She squeezed Sarah's arm, her own traumas surfacing in empathy's light. The overlooked pleas, the unity she'd chased at her own expense. "We were all scared. Hiding it kept us apart, but this is where we start seeing." Her voice softened, hopeful threads weaving through the fear, as the cafe's warm light caught the unshed tears, turning them to glimmers of possibility. In that shared silence, broken now by truths laid bare, the weight lifted fractionally. Empathy's first fragile blooms stirred, fear receding like a tide, leaving room for understanding's quiet dawn. As the cafe's warmth faded into the chill of evening streets, Jenna and David walked side by side, the letter's weight an invisible tether between them. Hours blurred into a quiet drive back to the family home, where shadows of old joys lingered in the creaking floors. Frustration simmered beneath her hopeful resolve, urging the truth forward. Yet in the introspective hush, a fragile bridge of understanding began to form, even as betrayal's echo threatened to widen the chasm. Outside the cafe window, the grind of tires on asphalt, a delivery truck's impatient horn slicing through midday traffic. Inside, Sarah's breath, shallow and ragged, syncing with the faint tick of the wall clock behind the counter. She leaned forward, elbows on the scarred oak table, the letter now smoothed between them like a truce flag half unfurled. David sat across, his knuckles still pale from gripping it moments ago, while Mark shifted in his chair beside her, the wooden legs scraping softly against the tile floor. The air carried the warm bite of fresh espresso from the barista station, mingling with the subtle, earthy scent of old paper from the letter, words their mother had left behind, unraveling the family's long-buried fracture. "I can't believe you kept this from us," Sarah said, her voice threading low, laced with the frustration that had simmered since David's hesitant reading aloud. The confession in the letter, Maya's hidden struggles, the abandonment that had splintered their childhood without a single adult ever stepping in, hit like gravel underfoot. Sarah's drive to unearth it all, to drag the shadows into light, clashed against the wall of years she'd built to sidestep the pain. But now, determination edged out her fear of rejection. She wouldn't let it fester unspoken again. David met her eyes, his facade cracking like thin ice under pressure. The vulnerability he dreaded, being seen as the weak link, the one left behind, stared back from her gaze. He swallowed, the motion pulling at the collar of his faded shirt. "There's more," he murmured, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if holding them longer would drown him. "I knew. About Maya. About everything. Long before she did." The table fell silent, save for the distant clink of spoons against saucers. Mark's hand froze midway to his coffee mug, his face paling as old anger flickered in his eyes. That shadow he wrestled daily, the rage born from wounds he could never quite cauterize. He leaned in, voice rough but seeking, driven by his own ache for connection. "You what? David, how? We were kids, all of us." David's gaze dropped to the letter, tracing the ink's faded loops. "Dad told me. That night, after the fight, the one where he packed his bags and never came back. He said Maya wasn't his, that Mom had lied about it all. I was 10. I thought if I said something, it'd break us worse. So I buried it. Watched her grow up pretending, same as us." His voice wavered, the admission peeling back layers he'd armored for decades. Fear of isolation clawed at him now, exposed in the quiet space between their stares. Would this make him the betrayer? The one who chose silence over salvation? Sarah's frustration boiled over, hot and unfiltered, her fingers curling into fists on the table's edge. Betrayal stung like salt in a fresh cut. How could he carry that alone, letting it poison their shared history? "You let me think we were in the dark together," she whispered, the words sharp, her chest tight with the rejection she dreaded most. Family turning inward, away from her resolve. Yet beneath the anger, a thread of something softer stirred. Understanding, tentative, like dawn light filtering through blinds. He'd hidden it to protect them, hadn't he? From the abandonment that echoed their father's flight. Mark reached out, his touch light on David's shoulder, a bridge across the rift. "We all hid pieces," he said softly, his vulnerability laid bare, anger yielding to the pull of empathy. "But saying it now, that's the start." David nodded, eyes lifting, the weight easing just a fraction. In that pause, the cafe's hum wrapped around them, steam hissing from the espresso machine, a barista's laugh cutting through, like the world outside insisting on continuation. Frustration lingered, a raw edge to their truths, but hope flickered in the shared glances, confessions forging new paths through the old ruins of their past. As the weight of the letter settled between them, vulnerability softened Sarah's guarded edges, a fragile hope flickering in the cafe's dim light. Hours blurred into evening, the city's hum fading as Maya sat alone, her mind tracing the threads of their shared past. By nightfall, she dialed her brother, their voices weaving a quiet pact. Together, they would seek the truths long buried, chasing closure like a tentative dawn. The family living room, dusk, lamps flickering on one by one against the fading light. Sarah pushed open the front door, the hinges creaking like a reluctant confession, the letter clutched in her fist, now creased from the drive back. Mark followed close, his footsteps heavy on the threshold, the scent of cooling asphalt clinging to his jacket. Inside, the air carried the faint tang of Jenna's chamomile tea, steeping forgotten on the side table beside her armchair. She looked up from her knitting, needles paused mid-stitch, her eyes narrowing at the tension etching their faces. "Sarah? Mark? What's this about?" Jenna's voice held its usual steady lilt, but a flicker of unease threaded through it, as if she sensed the gathering storm. Sarah crossed to the center of the room, the worn Persian rug muffling her steps, and unfolded the letter with deliberate care. The paper whispered against her palms, inked words from their late father blurring slightly under the lamp's glow, fragments of a past he'd buried deep. "Mom, we can't keep pretending. This changes everything." Her words tumbled out, raw and edged with the frustration she'd bottled for years, her drive to unearth the truth now overriding the old habit of sidestepping pain. She glanced at Mark, seeking his nod, her fear of rejection coiling tight in her chest. Mark sank onto the edge of the sofa, elbows on knees, the fabric of his shirt pulling taut across his shoulders. Vulnerability cracked through his usual guarded posture. He'd come home from the cafe, replaying their conversation, the weight of his own childhood scars pressing down. "It's about Dad," he said, voice low, almost swallowed by the room's quiet hum, the distant tick of the mantel clock, the soft rustle of Jenna's yarn. "And what he never told us. The fights, the secrets. I can't carry this anger anymore, Mom. It ate at him, and it's eating at me." His hands flexed, shadows of uncontrolled rage flickering in his eyes. But he held them still, reaching for connection instead, his fear of those old wounds laid bare, making his throat tighten. Jenna set her knitting aside, the needles clinking softly against the armrest. She leaned forward, her face a map of lines earned from years of holding the family together, her own drive to unite them, now tested by the crumbling walls of silence. "What letter? Show me." But her tone wavered, assertive edges softening as she took the paper, her fingers brushing Sarah's in a touch that lingered. Reading, her breath caught, the revelations spilling out like long-dammed water, infidelities unspoken, losses buried under forced smiles. Tears welled, unbidden, tracing paths down her cheeks, exposing the people-pleaser who'd sacrificed her voice for peace, now confronting the fear that this honesty might shatter them all. The room seemed to contract around their shared silence, broken only by the soft hitch of Jenna's sob. Sarah knelt beside her, hand on her knee, the warmth seeping through denim. "We're not accusing you. We need to understand. Together." Mark slid closer, his arm draping tentatively over Jenna's shoulders, the gesture awkward but earnest, a bridge over the chasm of avoidance. In that fragile circle, the old structures gave way, not with destruction, but with the slow release of buried light. Vulnerability hung between them, tender and exposing, yet laced with the quiet promise of mending. As dusk deepened outside, the lamps cast a warm glow, illuminating faces turned toward one another, hopeful in their rawness. As the door swung shut with a soft finality, The living room's lamps bathed the space in a gentle amber haze, softening the edges of unspoken burdens. Sarah's fingers uncurled from the letter, its creases like veins of hidden light, while Mark's steady presence anchored the moment. In that introspective hush, the air thickened with tentative hope, a bridge to understanding amid the gathering shadows of family truths yet to unfold. 2 hours of simmering glances had cracked the fragile peace in the living room, pulling Jenna and David from their corners like threads unraveling from a worn tapestry. Sarah, still gripping the crumpled letter, sank into the armchair, her knuckles pale against the faded upholstery. Mark paced near the window, the floorboards groaning under his steps, each one echoing the pulse of unspoken accusations. The scent of chamomile tea, long gone cold in forgotten mugs, mingled with the faint mustiness of bookshelves untouched for years. "I can't keep pretending this isn't tearing us apart," Mark said, his voice low but steady, like a dam finally giving way. He stopped, facing his mother, eyes searching hers for the connection he'd craved since childhood. Vulnerability hung in his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for the anger that always lurked beneath his skin. "That letter, it's not just words on paper, it's us. All the times we avoided talking, the silences that built these walls." Sarah's gaze flicked to the letter, then away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Mark. Always have. If you'd just let it go, like I did for all of you." Her words sharpened, deflecting like a shield raised too late. She turned to Jenna, who sat cross-legged on the sofa, fists clenched in her lap. "And you, Jenna, always stirring things up when we need unity. This family's held together because I made sacrifices, not because of your demands." Jenna's breath caught, a sharp inhale that filled the room's quiet. She leaned forward, her assertive fire kindling despite the fear twisting in her chest, the dread that her voice might shatter them all. "Mom, that's not fair. You've dismissed us for years, redirecting everything back to what you gave up. But what about what we need? I can't keep pleasing everyone if it means burying myself." Her words trembled at the edges, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally claiming space. The people's pleaser in her recoiled, yet she pressed on, eyes locking with Sarah's, seeking that bridge of understanding amid the rubble. David, silent until now in the shadowed alcove by the fireplace, shifted. His fingers traced the armrest's carved edge, a small anchor against the abandonment clawing at him. Cracks showed in his stoic facade, eyes glistening, jaw not clenched but softening. "It's not about blame," he murmured, voice rough like gravel underfoot. "It's about seeing each other. Really seeing." His drive to confront the isolation pushed him forward. He met Mark's gaze, then Jenna's, a tentative vulnerability blooming. Weakness terrified him. Yet here, in the upheaval, it felt like the first step toward not being left behind. Sarah's deflection faltered, her hands unfolding in her lap as the room's tension pressed in. The letter slipped to the floor, pages whispering against the rug. Mark knelt to retrieve it, his touch gentle, anger held at bay by the raw hope flickering among them. Jenna reached out, her hand hovering near her mother's knee, not grabbing, but offering. David's nod, subtle, wove them closer. In that crumbling moment, as defenses toppled and old wounds aired, a fragile understanding stirred. Not resolution, but the hopeful spark of connection, illuminating the debris like dawn through fractured glass. They sat, breaths sinking, the silence now a canvas for what might yet be rebuilt. As twilight softened the room's edges, the tension coiled tighter. Yet a subtle shift stirred within Sarah's guarded heart. Maya's steady presence, unspoken but insistent, wove through the quiet, nudging against years of buried pain. In that introspective hush, the first threads of vulnerability began to loosen, hinting at the healing words yet to come. Bathed in the gentle glow of emerging hope. 8:17 p.m. The clock on the mantel ticked onward, indifferent to the unraveling threads of the evening. Sarah's grip on the letter loosened just enough for it to slip from her fingers, fluttering to the carpet like a defeated flag. Jenna stepped forward from the shadowed edge of the room, her bare feet silent against the worn rug, eyes fixed on her mother's bowed head. "I can't keep pretending this isn't breaking us," Jenna said, her voice steady but laced with the quiet urgency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in whispers to herself. The words hung in the space between them, pulling David upright from his perch on the sofa's arm, his hands unclenching from the fabric as if released from an invisible bind. Sarah looked up, her face a map of etched lines, years of swallowed silences now surfacing.